The morning fog hung thick over London as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his crisp red uniform and checked his watch. 23 years of faithful service to the Crown had taught him to notice even the smallest details that others might miss. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Marcus had been assigned to the Royal Household Security Division since the early days of his military career. He'd witnessed countless state functions, private ceremonies, and intimate family moments that the public would never see. His loyalty to the monarchy was absolute, forged through years of witnessing the Queen's unwavering dedication to her duties even in her final months. The palace corridors echoed with unusual activity for a Tuesday morning. Staff members moved with purpose, their faces carrying expressions of barely concealed concern. Marcus had learned to read these subtle signs over the years. Something significant was happening, though the official channels remained silent. As he made his rounds through the East Wing, Marcus noticed several members of the senior household staff engaged in hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. The atmosphere reminded him of the tense days following major royal announcements, when protocol demanded absolute discretion from everyone within the palace walls. His radio crackled to life with routine security updates, but Marcus detected an underlying tension in the voices of his colleagues. The usual morning briefing had been postponed without explanation, and several high-ranking officials had arrived earlier than scheduled for what appeared to be emergency meetings. The Queen's recent passing had left everyone in a state of careful transition. New protocols were being established, responsibilities were shifting, and the entire royal machine was adapting to serve King Charles. During such periods of change, Marcus had observed, people sometimes made decisions they might later regret. Walking past the Queen's former private apartments, Marcus paused at the familiar doorway. These rooms held decades of memories, personal treasures, and items of immense historical significance. The official inventory process had begun, but access remained strictly controlled. Only a handful of individuals possessed the authority to enter these sacred spaces. A commotion near the service entrance caught his attention. Two junior staff members were struggling with what appeared to be heavy luggage, their movements awkward and nervous. When they spotted Marcus approaching, their conversation ceased immediately, and they hurried away without making eye contact. Marcus's instincts, honed by years of security training, began to signal alarm. The behavior patterns he was observing didn't align with normal palace operations. Staff members typically moved with confidence and purpose, not the furtive anxiety he was witnessing today. His phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor requesting an immediate meeting in the security office. As Marcus changed direction, he couldn't shake the feeling that events were unfolding that would test everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the institution he'd served his entire adult life. The security office was unusually crowded when Marcus arrived. Senior officers from various departments had gathered around a bank of monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the palace complex. The expressions on their faces ranged from confusion to outright concern. Thompson, his supervisor, called out, "We need your eyes on something. You know the protocols better than anyone. And we need someone with your experience to help us understand what we're seeing." Marcus approached the monitors, where several screens showed different angles of the palace's interior corridors and entrances. Timestamps indicated the footage was from early that morning, around the time he'd begun his shift. "Watch this carefully," his supervisor said, pointing to one particular screen. "Camera 7, East Corridor, 0830 hours. The grainy footage showed a figure moving purposefully through the corridors, clearly familiar with the layout and security procedures. The person carried what appeared to be a large bag, and moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in these restricted areas. Marcus studied the footage intently, his trained eye picking up details that others might miss. The way the figure moved, the familiarity with door codes, the timing that avoided peak staff periods, everything suggested this was not a random intruder, but someone with legitimate access and extensive knowledge of palace operations. "Keep watching," his supervisor urged. "Camera 12, Main Vault Corridor, 0845 hours. The next sequence showed the same figure near the area where many of the Queen's personal effects were being cataloged and secured. The individual appeared to be accessing areas that required the highest levels of clearance, moving with purpose rather than the careful reverence typically shown in these sacred spaces. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as recognition began to dawn. The height, the posture, the confident stride. These were characteristics he'd observed countless times during official functions and private moments within the palace walls. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe I know who this is." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Marcus had built his reputation on accuracy and discretion, and his colleagues knew that when he spoke with certainty, his observations were typically correct. The movement patterns, the access knowledge, the timing. "This appears to be someone with the highest levels of clearance," Marcus continued, choosing his words carefully. "Someone who would never be questioned by security personnel." His supervisor leaned forward, understanding the implications of what Marcus was suggesting. If his assessment was correct, they were dealing with a situation that went far beyond routine security concerns. This involved someone at the very heart of the royal family. "We need to verify current locations of all senior family members," his supervisor ordered. "Discreetly, and we need to check the status of all high-value items in the Queen's collection." As the team sprang into action, Marcus remained focused on the monitors, replaying the footage and noting additional details. The implications of what they were uncovering would send shockwaves through the very foundations of the monarchy if his suspicions proved correct. The morning that had begun with routine patrols was rapidly becoming one of the most significant days of Marcus's career, and potentially one of the most challenging periods in recent royal history. The investigation moved swiftly once Marcus's initial assessment reached the senior security team. Within 30 minutes, a discreet verification process had begun to account for all members of the royal family and their current whereabouts. The results sent waves of concern through the security apparatus. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams from the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Unit arrived at the palace within the hour. Her experience with high-profile cases involving the royal family made her the obvious choice to lead what was rapidly becoming a delicate and potentially explosive investigation. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, extending her hand, "I understand you were first to identify the significance of the security footage. Walk me through exactly what you observed." Marcus led her to the monitoring station, where the relevant footage had been isolated and enhanced. Frame by frame, they analyzed the movements, the timing, and the apparent familiarity with palace protocols that the figure demonstrated. "The access patterns are what concern me most," Marcus explained. "This person knew exactly which cameras to avoid, which corridors would be empty at specific times, and how to move through the most secure areas without triggering any automated alerts." Detective Inspector Williams nodded grimly. "Which tells us we're dealing with someone who has extensive knowledge of palace security procedures, someone who's been briefed on protocols that are shared only with immediate family members and the most senior staff." Meanwhile, a parallel investigation was beginning in the Queen's former private chambers. The inventory team, led by the Royal Collection Trust, was conducting an emergency audit of the most valuable and historically significant items. The initial results were troubling. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the chief curator, emerged from the Queen's private study with the expression of barely controlled alarm. In her hands, she carried a leather-bound inventory book that had been maintained for decades, documenting every significant piece in the Queen's personal collection. "We have a serious problem," Dr. Hartwell announced to the assembled security team. "Several items of extraordinary value and historical significance are unaccounted for. These aren't pieces that could simply be misplaced or temporarily relocated." She opened the inventory book to pages marked with red tabs, indicating items of the highest classification. The Duchess of Cambridge's emerald tiara, gifted to the Queen by her grandmother, Queen Mary. A collection of diamond brooches that belonged to Queen Victoria. And most concerning of all, the personal jewelry box that contained the Queen's most treasured pieces from her private collection. Detective Inspector Williams felt the weight of the situation intensifying. "These items, they're not just valuable in monetary terms, are they?" "Absolutely not, Doctor," Hartwell replied. "Each piece carries immense historical significance and emotional value to the royal family. The jewelry box alone contains pieces that have been passed down through generations, including items that were specifically mentioned, in the Queen's private will as intended for particular family members. Marcus absorbed this information with growing unease. During his years of service, he'd witnessed the Queen's deep emotional connection to these personal treasures. She'd often spoken of them as links to her ancestors and as gifts intended for future generations of the royal family. The investigation took on new urgency as additional security footage was retrieved and analyzed. The timestamps revealed a pattern of activity that began in the early hours of the morning and continued for several hours, suggesting careful planning and ample time to select specific items. "We need to expand our search beyond the palace," Detective Inspector Williams decided. "If these items have been removed from the premises, we need to track movements and destinations immediately." The security team quickly accessed footage from external cameras monitoring all palace exits and the surrounding streets. The task was complicated by the volume of legitimate traffic in and out of the palace during the morning hours, including official vehicles, staff transportation, and delivery services. However, Marcus's trained eye once again proved invaluable. On footage from the main gate camera, he identified a familiar vehicle departing the palace at approximately 10:30 that morning. The timing aligned perfectly with the internal security footage they'd been analyzing. "That's a vehicle I've seen numerous times," Marcus reported. "It's one of the cars regularly used by senior family members for private transportation, not official state business." Detective Inspector Williams immediately ordered a trace on the vehicle's GPS tracking system, standard equipment in all royal family cars for security purposes. The results provided their first concrete lead in what was becoming an increasingly complex investigation. The vehicle proceeded directly to Heathrow Airport, the technical specialist reported. It arrived at Terminal 5 at approximately 11:15 and remained there for 47 minutes before departing. The airport connection added a new dimension to the investigation. If valuable royal artifacts were being transported internationally, the legal and diplomatic implications could be enormous. The team would need to coordinate with airport security, customs officials, and potentially international law enforcement agencies. Detective Inspector Williams contacted her counterpart at Heathrow's Security Operations Center. "We need immediate access to all security footage from Terminal 5 between 11 and 12:30 this morning. We're tracking a potential theft of items belonging to the Crown Estate." Within minutes, airport security was pulling footage from cameras throughout the terminal, focusing on areas near the departure gates for international flights. The investigation was expanding rapidly, but time was working against them. Marcus remained at the palace, continuing to analyze internal security footage and coordinate with the inventory team as they discovered additional missing items. Each new revelation painted a more concerning picture of the scope and planning involved in what appeared to be a systematic removal of the Queen's most precious personal belongings. The afternoon brought a development that would change everything. Airport security located footage showing the familiar figure from the palace cameras moving through Terminal 5 with several pieces of luggage. More significantly, they identified the specific flight that had been boarded. Flight BA 285 to Paris, the airport security coordinator reported, departed at 13:45, approximately 2 hours ago. Detective Inspector Williams realized they were now dealing with an international incident. The missing royal artifacts had potentially crossed into French jurisdiction, requiring immediate coordination with European law enforcement agencies and careful handling of diplomatic sensitivities. As the investigation expanded beyond British borders, Marcus reflected on the morning's events and their potential consequences. His routine security patrol had uncovered what appeared to be one of the most significant breaches of royal security in modern history, involving someone with intimate access to the royal family's most treasured possessions. The revelation that the missing artifacts had been transported to Paris triggered an immediate escalation to the highest levels of both British and French law enforcement. Detective Inspector Williams found herself coordinating with Interpol, the French National Police, and diplomatic officials from both countries as the investigation took on international dimensions. At Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, French authorities were already reviewing security footage and passenger manifests from the British Airways flight that had arrived that afternoon. The cooperation between the two countries was swift, reflecting the serious nature of potential theft from the British Crown Estate. Back at Buckingham Palace, Marcus continued his detailed analysis of the internal security systems. His methodical approach was revealing additional concerning patterns that had initially been overlooked in the urgency of tracking the missing artifacts. "Inspector," Marcus called out as Detective Inspector Williams returned from a briefing with senior palace officials. "I've discovered something that might explain how this operation was planned so carefully." He gestured to a computer screen, displaying access logs for the palace's internal security system. "Someone has been reviewing camera schedules and guard rotation patterns for the past 3 weeks. The access times correspond with periods when they would have been alone and unobserved." Detective Inspector Williams studied the data, recognizing the implications immediately. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. Someone spent weeks studying our security procedures, identifying vulnerabilities, and planning the optimal timing for removing these items. The premeditation aspect of the crime added another layer of seriousness to the investigation. This wasn't a moment of opportunity or emotional impulse, but a calculated plan executed with knowledge that only someone with the highest level of access could possess. Meanwhile, in Paris, French investigators had made significant progress in tracking the movements of the individual who had arrived on the British Airways flight. Airport security footage showed the person proceeding through customs with several pieces of luggage, then meeting with someone in the arrivals area. The subject was met by an individual who appears to be a private driver, reported Captain Marie Dubois of the French National Police. They departed the airport in a black Mercedes sedan, license plate registered to a private car service frequently used by wealthy international clients. The French authorities were now tracking the Mercedes through Paris's extensive network of traffic cameras. The vehicle had proceeded to the 16th arrondissement, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, known for its luxury hotels and high-end shopping districts. Back in London, the investigation was revealing the full scope of the missing items. Dr. Hartwell and her team had completed their emergency inventory, and the results were staggering. More than 40 pieces were unaccounted for, representing not just enormous monetary value but irreplaceable historical artifacts. The selection appears to have been made by someone with intimate knowledge of the collection's most significant pieces, Dr. Hartwell reported. These weren't random items grabbed in haste. Someone chose specifically the pieces with the greatest historical importance and emotional significance to the royal family. Among the missing items were pieces that had been worn by Queen Elizabeth during major state occasions, jewelry that had belonged to Queen Victoria and Queen Mary, and several pieces that had been specifically mentioned in recent conversations about inheritance plans for future generations. Detective Inspector Williams was coordinating with legal experts to understand the full implications of the theft. The items belonged to the Crown estate, making this not just a criminal matter, but potentially an issue of constitutional significance. "We're dealing with more than simple theft," explained Sir Richard Pemberton, the Queen's former private secretary who had been called in to assist with the investigation. "These items are held in trust for the nation. Their removal could constitute a violation of constitutional law as well as criminal statutes." The afternoon brought a breakthrough from Paris. French investigators had traced the Mercedes to the Hotel Plaza Athénée, where the vehicle had stopped for approximately 2 hours before continuing to an address in the 7th arrondissement near the Invalides. The address corresponds to a private residence owned by a shell company registered in Monaco, Captain Dubois reported via secure video link. "We've placed the location under discreet surveillance while we obtain the necessary warrants for a search." The international nature of the investigation was creating complex legal challenges. British authorities needed to work through diplomatic channels to ensure that any evidence collected in France would be admissible in British courts, while also respecting French sovereignty and legal procedures. Marcus, meanwhile, had been working with the palace's IT security team to trace all digital communications that might be related to the investigation. His systematic approach was yielding additional insights into the planning and execution of the operation. "We found evidence of encrypted email communications over the past month," Marcus reported. The messages were sent using the palace's secure communication system, but to external email addresses that we're still working to identify. The digital trail suggested coordination with outside parties, possibly including individuals who specialized in the discreet sale or transportation of high-value artifacts. This raised the possibility that the theft was part of a larger network involved in trafficking stolen cultural artifacts. As evening approached in London, the investigation had evolved from a palace security breach to an international criminal matter involving multiple law enforcement agencies, diplomatic officials, and legal experts from several countries. Detective Inspector Williams found herself at the center of what was becoming one of the most complex and sensitive investigations of her career. The missing artifacts represented not just material value but the very heritage of the British monarchy, items that connected the current royal family to centuries of history and tradition. The pressure to resolve the situation quickly was immense, but the international scope of the investigation required careful coordination and patience. Every step needed to be documented meticulously to ensure that any legal proceedings would withstand scrutiny in multiple jurisdictions. Marcus remained focused on his detailed analysis of the palace security systems, knowing that his observations might provide crucial evidence for understanding exactly how the theft had been accomplished and by whom. His 23 years of loyal service had prepared him for many challenges, but nothing quite like this unprecedented breach of royal security. As night fell over both London and Paris, investigators on both sides of the English Channel were working around the clock to track down the missing royal artifacts and bring those responsible to justice. The next phase of the investigation would require careful planning and flawless execution to avoid any missteps that could compromise the recovery of items that belong to the very heart of British royal heritage. The breakthrough came at 6:30 the following morning, when French surveillance teams observed movement at the private residence in the 7th arrondissement. Captain Dubois immediately contacted Detective Inspector Williams with an urgent update that would change the entire direction of the investigation. "We have positive identification," Captain Dubois reported via secure communication. "The individual who arrived yesterday from London has been confirmed through facial recognition and is currently at the residence with what appears to be the luggage observed at the airport." Detective Inspector Williams felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. While they had successfully tracked the missing artifacts to a specific location, the process of recovery would require delicate handling, given the high-profile nature of the case and the potential international diplomatic implications. "We're prepared to execute a search warrant, but given the sensitivity of this matter, we wanted to coordinate our approach with British authorities," Captain Dubois continued. "The French prosecutor's office is standing by for immediate action once we receive confirmation from your end." The coordination between British and French authorities reflected the extraordinary nature of the case. Rarely did investigations involving the British royal family require such rapid international cooperation, and both governments were treating the matter with the highest priority. Back at Buckingham Palace, Marcus had spent the night reviewing every piece of security footage and access log from the past month. His thorough analysis was providing investigators with a detailed timeline of how the theft had been planned and executed. "The pattern is clear once you know what to look for," Marcus explained to Detective Inspector Williams during their early morning briefing. "The reconnaissance phase began 3 weeks ago, with systematic reviews of security procedures during times when the individual would have been alone in the relevant areas. Marcus had identified 17 separate occasions when someone had accessed secure areas of the palace outside of normal visiting hours, always during periods when staff coverage was minimal and security patrols were predictable. The timing was perfect," Marcus continued. "They knew exactly when guards would be changing shifts, when cleaning staff would be in other areas, and when the automated security systems would be in their standard monitoring mode, rather than high alert status." Dr. Hartwell joined the briefing with additional disturbing news about the scope of the theft. "We've completed our comprehensive inventory, and I'm afraid the situation is even more serious than we initially believed. The total value of missing items exceeds £15 million, but more importantly, several pieces are literally irreplaceable artifacts of British royal history. Among the missing items was Queen Victoria's personal prayer book, bound in jewel-encrusted gold and containing handwritten notes from the monarch. Also missing was a diamond and sapphire necklace that had been a wedding gift from Prince Albert to Queen Victoria, never before removed from the royal collection. These items aren't just valuable," Dr. Hartwell emphasized. "They're integral parts of British heritage that have been in the royal collection for more than a century. Their loss would be devastating not just to the royal family, but to the nation's cultural patrimony. The morning brought additional pressure as news of the investigation began to leak to the media. Palace officials were working frantically to control information flow while investigators raced to recover the artifacts before the story became public knowledge. We have perhaps 6 hours before this becomes a major international news story, Sir Richard Pemberton warned. Once the media learns about the theft, our ability to conduct discreet recovery operations will be severely compromised. In Paris, French authorities were finalizing their operation to search the residence where the artifacts were believed to be located. The building was a 19th-century mansion that had been converted into luxury apartments, with the specific unit in question registered to a company with connections to international art dealers. We've identified the apartment's occupant as Henri Beaumont, a dealer in rare artifacts and historical collectibles, Captain Dubois reported. His background check reveals previous involvement in transactions involving items of questionable provenance, though he's never been formally charged with any crimes. The connection to an art dealer suggested that the theft might have been commissioned by private collectors, willing to pay enormous sums for unique historical artifacts, regardless of their legal status. This possibility added urgency to the recovery operation, as such items could quickly disappear into private collections where they might remain hidden for decades. Detective Inspector Williams made the decision to travel to Paris personally to coordinate the recovery operation. The diplomatic sensitivity of the case required someone with her level of experience and authority to ensure that all procedures were followed correctly. This isn't just about recovering stolen property, she explained to her team before departing. We're dealing with artifacts that belong to the British Crown, and any mistakes in the recovery process could have serious diplomatic consequences. Marcus remained at the palace, continuing his analysis of the security breach and working with technical experts to ensure that similar vulnerabilities couldn't be exploited in the future. His detailed work was revealing the sophisticated nature of the planning that had gone into the theft. Whoever planned this operation had access to information that should have been available only to the most senior members of the royal household. Marcus reported to his superiors. The knowledge of security procedures, inventory locations, and timing was far too detailed to have been obtained through casual observation. This realization was leading investigators toward an uncomfortable conclusion. The theft had likely been facilitated by someone with legitimate access to the highest levels of royal security information. Meanwhile, in Paris, the final preparations for the search operation were being completed. French investigators had obtained all necessary warrants and had coordinated with British diplomatic officials to ensure that the recovery process would be legally sound and politically appropriate. We're treating this as a recovery operation rather than a raid, Captain Dubois explained to her team. The goal is to secure the artifacts and gather evidence while maintaining the dignity appropriate to items belonging to the British Crown. As afternoon approached, both British and French authorities were positioned for what they hoped would be the successful recovery of the stolen royal artifacts. The operation would need to be executed flawlessly to avoid any complications that could jeopardize the return of items that represented centuries of British royal history. Detective Inspector Williams arrived in Paris on a diplomatic flight, carrying with her detailed documentation of each missing artifact and authorization from the highest levels of the British government to coordinate the recovery operation with French authorities. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether one of the most audacious thefts in royal history would be successfully resolved or whether priceless artifacts would disappear forever into the shadowy world of international art trafficking. Marcus, monitoring the situation from London, reflected on how his routine morning patrol had uncovered what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated operation targeting the very heart of British royal heritage. The next few hours would determine whether his vigilance had been enough to prevent an irreplaceable loss to the nation's cultural treasures. The operation commenced at precisely 1400 hours Paris time, with French tactical teams positioning themselves around the 19th century mansion, while Detective Inspector Williams coordinated from a command vehicle stationed 1 block away. The careful planning reflected the delicate nature of recovering artifacts belonging to the British Crown. Henri Beaumont's apartment occupied the entire third floor of the elegant building, its windows overlooking a quiet courtyard typical of exclusive Parisian neighborhoods. Surveillance teams had confirmed movement within the apartment throughout the morning, suggesting that the occupants were unaware of the investigation closing around them. "All units in position," Captain Dubois reported through her radio. "We have confirmation that both subjects are present in the apartment, along with what appears to be multiple pieces of luggage, consistent with items transported from London." Yesterday, Detective Inspector Williams felt the weight of responsibility as she coordinated with both French authorities and officials back in London. The success of this operation would determine whether irreplaceable royal artifacts could be recovered or whether they would disappear into the international black market forever. The entry team moved with professional precision, using master keys provided by the building management to avoid the dramatic forced entry that might damage any artifacts inside. Within minutes, they had secured the apartment and were beginning the delicate process of cataloging what they had discovered. "Inspector Williams," Captain Dubois called excitedly over the radio. "You need to see this immediately. We've found the luggage and it appears to contain exactly what we were looking for." Detective Inspector Williams rushed into the apartment, where she was greeted by an extraordinary sight. Spread across an antique dining table were dozens of pieces from the Queen's personal collection, each item carefully wrapped in silk cloth and arranged with obvious reverence for their historical significance. The Queen Victoria prayer book lay open, its jewel-encrusted cover glinting in the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Beside it, the diamond and sapphire necklace that had been Prince Albert's wedding gift was displayed with museum-quality care, each stone catching the light with brilliant clarity. "This is remarkable," Detective Inspector Williams murmured, recognizing pieces she had seen only in official photographs during state occasions. "The collection is more extensive than we realized, and everything appears to have been handled with extraordinary care." Henri Beaumont, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothing, stood quietly in the corner of the room under guard. His expression suggested resignation rather than surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment. "Monsieur Beaumont," Detective Inspector Williams addressed him in French. "I am Inspector Williams from the London Metropolitan Police. We need to discuss how these items came to be in your possession." Beaumont's response was measured and careful. "Inspector, I want to assure you that I had no knowledge these items were obtained illegally. I was contacted by a client who wished to have certain pieces evaluated for insurance purposes. I assumed all appropriate ownership documentation would be provided." The claim seemed implausible given Beaumont's reputation as an expert in historical artifacts. Someone with his experience would certainly recognize pieces from the British royal collection, especially items as distinctive as Queen Victoria's personal effects. Captain Dubois was coordinating with her forensics team to photograph and document each artifact before they could be safely packaged for return to London. The process required extreme care, as any damage to these irreplaceable items would be catastrophic. "We're treating each piece as if it were a crime scene exhibit," Captain Dubois explained. "Every item needs to be documented in its current condition, photographed from multiple angles, and packaged using museum-standard conservation techniques." While the recovery operation proceeded in Paris, Marcus was receiving updates at Buckingham Palace and coordinating with Dr. Hartwell to prepare for the artifact's return. The palace conservation team was already preparing specialized storage and examination facilities to assess any damage that might have occurred during the theft and transportation. The preliminary inventory from Paris suggests that all major pieces have been recovered, Marcus reported to Detective Inspector Williams via secure communication. Dr. Hartwell is particularly relieved that Queen Victoria's prayer book appears to be undamaged, as it's one of the most fragile items in the collection. However, the investigation was far from complete. While the artifacts had been successfully located and secured, the question of how they had been removed from the palace in the first place remained unanswered. The careful planning and intimate knowledge of palace security procedures suggested involvement by someone with the highest levels of access. Back in Paris, Detective Inspector Williams was conducting a formal interview with Henri Beaumont, hoping to trace the chain of events that had brought the royal artifacts to his apartment. His responses were providing crucial insights into what appeared to be a sophisticated operation. The initial contact came 3 weeks ago, Beaumont explained. A woman called, speaking excellent French but with a slight English accent. She explained that she represented a private collector who owned several pieces that needed professional evaluation for insurance purposes. The timeline aligned perfectly with Marcus's analysis of the security reconnaissance that had been conducted at the palace. Someone had been planning this operation for weeks, using Beaumont's expertise to ensure that the stolen artifacts would be properly handled and potentially sold to private collectors. She was very specific about the type of expertise required. Beaumont continued. The pieces were described as 18th and 19th century British royal jewelry and personal effects. I was told they had been inherited through family connections to minor aristocracy. Detective Inspector Williams recognized the sophisticated nature of the cover story. By claiming the items were inherited from aristocratic connections, the thief had provided a plausible explanation for possessing royal artifacts while avoiding the obvious questions that would arise from attempting to sell such distinctive pieces openly. The investigation was revealing layers of planning that suggested professional involvement in art theft and trafficking. The use of an established dealer like Beaumont provided legitimacy and expertise that would be essential for moving such high-profile items through international markets. Monsieur Beaumont? Detective Inspector Williams pressed. Surely someone with your experience would recognize pieces from the British Royal Collection. These items have been photographed extensively during state occasions and public ceremonies. Beaumont's expression showed the first signs of discomfort since the interview began. Inspector, I must admit that some pieces did seem familiar. However, I was assured that all legal documentation would be provided before any formal evaluations or transactions took place. The admission suggested that Beaumont had suspected the true nature of the artifacts but had chosen to proceed based on assurances from his client. This willful blindness to obvious red flags might constitute criminal complicity in the theft. As the afternoon progressed, the recovery operation in Paris was nearing completion. All identified artifacts had been successfully secured and documented, and arrangements were being made for their immediate return to London under diplomatic protection. However, Detective Inspector Williams knew that the most challenging phase of the investigation was just beginning. While they had successfully recovered the stolen royal artifacts, the question of who had removed them from Buckingham Palace remained unanswered, and the implications of that answer could shake the very foundations of the royal family. The flight back to London carrying the recovered royal artifacts departed Paris under extraordinary security measures. Detective Inspector Williams accompanied the precious cargo personally, knowing that these items represented not just monetary value, but the very heritage of the British monarchy. However, her relief at the successful recovery was tempered by the knowledge that the most difficult phase of the investigation lay ahead. During the flight, she received an encrypted communication from Marcus that would change everything about how they understood the case. His continued analysis of palace security systems had uncovered evidence that pointed toward a conclusion almost too shocking to contemplate. Inspector? Marcus's voice was tense over the secure communication link. I've found something that you need to see immediately upon your return. The pattern of access and the timing of security system queries suggests that we're dealing with someone at the very highest levels of the royal household. The implications of Marcus's discovery began to sink in as Detective Inspector Williams reviewed the preliminary evidence he had transmitted. The sophistication of the operation, the intimate knowledge of palace procedures, and the careful selection of specific artifacts all pointed toward involvement by someone with unprecedented access to royal family secrets. Upon landing at RAF Northolt, the recovered artifacts were immediately transported to Buckingham Palace under armed escort. Dr. Hartwell and her conservation team were waiting to begin the careful process of examining each piece for any damage that might have occurred during their unauthorized journey to Paris. Thank goodness. Dr. Hartwell breathed as she carefully lifted Queen Victoria's prayer book from its protective casing. The binding appears intact and there's no visible damage to the jeweled cover. We'll need to conduct detailed conservation assessments, but initial examination suggests everything has been treated with appropriate care. The recovery of the artifacts intact was a massive relief. But Detective Inspector Williams knew that the investigation was entering its most sensitive phase. The evidence Marcus had compiled during her absence pointed toward a suspect whose identity would send shockwaves through the monarchy and potentially destabilize the institution itself. "Show me everything," she instructed Marcus as they gathered in the secure briefing room that had become the investigation's headquarters. The walls were now covered with timeline charts, security footage screenshots, and access logs that told the story of a meticulously planned operation. Marcus had spent 48 hours assembling a comprehensive picture of how the theft had been accomplished. "The breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the security system access logs with the official calendar of royal family activities," he explained, pointing to a complex chart showing dates, times, and corresponding events. "Look at this pattern," Marcus continued, highlighting specific entries on the timeline. "Every single reconnaissance visit to secure areas corresponds with periods when this individual had legitimate reasons to be in the palace but was not scheduled for any official duties or public appearances." The methodical nature of the planning was staggering. Someone had spent weeks studying security procedures, identifying optimal timing for accessing restricted areas, and selecting specific items from the Queen's personal collection with knowledge that could only come from intimate familiarity with the royal family's most private possessions. "The final piece of evidence came from the encrypted email communications I mentioned earlier," Marcus said, pulling up a series of message logs on his computer screen. "We've finally managed to trace the external email addresses that were receiving information about palace security procedures. The email trail led to addresses registered under false names but traced to internet service providers in Monaco and Switzerland, jurisdictions known for their banking secrecy and discretion in handling transactions involving high-value assets. This wasn't just theft, Detective Inspector Williams realized as she absorbed the full scope of the evidence. This was a sophisticated operation involving international networks, probably designed to move these artifacts into private collections where they might never be recovered. The investigation was revealing connections to the shadowy world of art, theft, and cultural trafficking, where stolen artifacts from museums and private collections disappeared into the hands of wealthy collectors who cared little about legal ownership, as long as they could possess unique historical treasures. However, all of this sophisticated planning and international coordination meant nothing without someone inside the palace who had the access, knowledge, and opportunity to remove the artifacts from their secure locations. And Marcus's evidence was pointing toward a conclusion that would rock the very foundations of the British monarchy. "Inspector," Marcus said quietly, his voice reflecting the gravity of what he was about to reveal, "based on the access patterns, the timing of the reconnaissance activities, and the specific knowledge required to select these particular artifacts, I believe we can identify the individual responsible for removing these items from the palace." Detective Inspector Williams felt her pulse quicken as she realized they were approaching the moment of truth in an investigation that had already exceeded anything in her extensive experience with royal security matters. Marcus pulled up the most crucial piece of evidence, enhanced security footage that clearly showed the individual responsible for the theft moving through palace corridors with confidence and familiarity that could only come from years of intimate access to these secure areas. The height, the posture, the movement patterns, and most importantly, the obvious familiarity with areas that are restricted to only the most senior members of the royal family, Marcus explained, pausing before delivering the conclusion that would change everything. "Inspector, the evidence clearly indicates that the person responsible for removing these artifacts from Buckingham Palace is Her Majesty Queen Camilla." The words hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Detective Inspector Williams felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet as she absorbed the implications of Marcus's conclusion. They were accusing the Queen Consort herself of systematically stealing artifacts from the late Queen Elizabeth's personal collection. "Are you absolutely certain of this identification?" Detective Inspector Williams asked, knowing that even the suggestion of such an accusation could have consequences that extended far beyond their investigation. Marcus nodded grimly. "I've reviewed the evidence hundreds of times hoping to find an alternative explanation. But the access patterns, the timing, the knowledge of security procedures, and the visual identification from multiple camera angles all point to the same Conclusion: the investigation had uncovered what appeared to be an unprecedented breach of trust at the very heart of the British monarchy. Queen Camilla, who had recently assumed her role as Queen Consort following the death of Queen Elizabeth, appeared to have been systematically removing valuable artifacts from the late Queen's personal collection. As the evening light faded over London, Detective Inspector Williams and Marcus found themselves confronting evidence of a crime that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, duty, and the sacred trust that bound the royal family together. The successful recovery of the stolen artifacts was now overshadowed by the devastating revelation of who had taken them in the first place. The next phase of their investigation would require navigating uncharted territory in British law enforcement as they prepared to confront a situation that had no precedent in the modern history of the monarchy. The confrontation came at dawn on the third day of the investigation. Detective Inspector Williams, accompanied by senior officials from the Metropolitan Police and representatives of the Crown Prosecution Service, requested an immediate private audience with Queen Camilla at Clarence House. The gravity of the situation required the most delicate handling in the history of modern royal law enforcement. Marcus remained at Buckingham Palace, coordinating with security teams and ensuring that all evidence was properly documented and secured. His meticulous work over the past 72 hours had built an unshakable case, but the implications of pursuing charges against the Queen Consort were unprecedented in British legal history. Your Majesty, Detective Inspector Williams began carefully as they gathered in the drawing room at Clarence House. We need to discuss certain irregularities that have come to light regarding items from the late Queen's personal collection. Queen Camilla's initial response was composed, befitting someone accustomed to handling difficult situations with royal dignity. However, Detective Inspector Williams noticed subtle signs of tension that suggested awareness of why this meeting had been arranged. "I'm afraid I don't understand what irregularities you might be referring to," Queen Camilla replied. "The transition of the late Queen's personal effects is being handled according to established protocols by the appropriate palace officials." Detective Inspector Williams exchanged glances with her colleagues before continuing. "Your Majesty, we have recovered 43 items from the late Queen's personal collection that were removed from Buckingham Palace without authorization. These items were found in Paris, in the possession of an art dealer who claims to have been contacted about providing evaluation services." The mention of Paris brought the first visible change in Queen Camilla's expression. The composed royal facade showed momentary cracks as the reality of the investigation's scope became apparent. Furthermore, Detective Inspector Williams continued, "Our investigation has revealed extensive planning over a 3-week period, including reconnaissance of palace security procedures and coordination with international networks involved in high-value art transactions. The evidence was overwhelming, but the process of formally accusing a member of the royal family required extraordinary care. British constitutional law provided limited guidance for situations where senior royals might be involved in criminal activity." Queen Camilla remained silent for several long moments, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she appeared to consider her options. Finally, she spoke with the measured tone of someone who had reached a difficult decision. "Inspector Williams, I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about my activities over the past few weeks. Perhaps it would be helpful if I explained the context of certain decisions I made regarding the late Queen's personal effects." The admission that followed would reshape the investigation and provide insights into motivations that were more complex than simple theft. Queen Camilla's explanation revealed a web of family tensions, inheritance disputes, and concerns about the preservation of royal heritage that had driven her to take desperate measures. The late Queen had expressed specific wishes about certain items in her personal collection, Queen Camilla explained. She wanted particular pieces to be preserved for future generations, not dispersed according to formal inheritance protocols that might see them placed in storage or even sold to support royal finances. The revelation added nuance to what had appeared to be straightforward theft. Queen Camilla claimed she was acting to honor the late Queen's private wishes, which differed from the official distribution plans being implemented by palace administrators. I was concerned that bureaucratic processes would not adequately protect items that held deep personal significance to the late Queen, she continued. My intention was to ensure these pieces were properly evaluated and secured before any final decisions were made about their permanent disposition. Detective Inspector Williams recognized the sophistication of this defense strategy. By claiming to act in the late Queen's interests, Queen Camilla was positioning her actions as protective rather than criminal, even though the legal reality remained that she had removed valuable property without authorization. Your Majesty, Detective Inspector Williams responded carefully, while your concerns about the preservation of these items may be understandable, the method chosen involved removing property belonging to the Crown estate without proper legal authority. Additionally, the involvement of international art dealers raises serious questions about the intended ultimate disposition of these artifacts. The evidence Marcus had compiled made it clear that this was not a simple case of family disagreement about inheritance. The sophisticated planning, international coordination, and use of art dealers known for handling questionable acquisitions suggested a more serious intent to permanently remove these items from royal possession. Queen Camilla's legal representatives, who had been contacted as the investigation developed, were now present to help navigate the unprecedented constitutional and legal complexities of the situation. The prospect of criminal charges against the Queen Consort raised questions that British law had never been forced to address. The situation presents extraordinary challenges for all parties involved. Sir James Pemberton, Queen Camilla's senior legal counsel, acknowledged, "We are dealing with matters that intersect criminal law, constitutional law, and the unique legal status of the royal family in ways that have no clear precedent." The negotiation that followed would determine not just the immediate resolution of the theft case, but potentially the future relationship between the royal family and British law enforcement. The precedent set by this case would influence how similar situations might be handled for generations to come. After hours of careful discussion involving lawyers, constitutional experts, and senior government officials, an agreement was reached that balanced the need for justice with the unique circumstances surrounding the case. Queen Camilla agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, provide detailed information about her motivations and actions, and accept responsibility for her role in the unauthorized removal of the royal artifacts. In exchange, consideration would be given to the complex family and constitutional factors that had influenced her decisions. The Crown Prosecution Service has determined that the unique circumstances of this case, including the defendant's cooperation and the successful recovery of all stolen property, warrant consideration of alternative resolution mechanisms, the senior prosecutor announced. The resolution involved Queen Camilla accepting a formal caution for theft, requiring her to participate in a restorative justice process, focused on understanding the impact of her actions on royal institutions and staff members who had been affected by the investigation. Additionally, she agreed to make substantial charitable contributions to organizations focused on preserving British cultural heritage, acknowledging the serious nature of her actions while avoiding the constitutional crisis that would have resulted from criminal prosecution of the Queen Consort. Marcus, observing the conclusion of the investigation he had initiated with his careful security observations, reflected on the extraordinary events of the past week. His routine morning patrol had uncovered not just a sophisticated theft, but family tensions and institutional pressures that reached to the very heart of the British monarchy. The case would remain classified for decades, but the lessons learned about royal security procedures, family dynamics, and the intersection of personal motivations with institutional responsibilities would influence palace operations for years to come. As the recovered artifacts were returned to their proper places in the royal collection, Marcus resumed his regular duties with a deeper understanding of the complex human emotions that could drive even the most privileged individuals to make decisions they would later regret. His vigilance had not only recovered irreplaceable cultural treasures, but had also revealed truths about power, family, and loyalty that would reshape his understanding of the institution he had served faithfully for more than 2 decades.